Hello, this is Gavin Morris, and my presentation is called Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Nationalism, Religion, and the Making of Modern India. I want to explore Bal Gangadhar Tilak not simply as an early nationalist leader, but as someone through which we can think about the emergence of modern South Asian politics. Tilak occupies a complicated place in Indian history. He was a fierce advocate of self rule, a cultural revivalist, a social conservative, and for many scholars, an early architect of the language that later hardened into Hindu majoritarian politics. So instead of a biographical report, this lecture uses Tilak to eliminate themes of nationalism, religion, and political mobilization in late colonial India. Tilak emerged at a moment when British power seemed overwhelming, but new political institutions and modern print culture opened space for critique. The Indian National Congress had just formed in 1885. At the time, a Hindu cultural revival was underway. Reformers, Sanskritists, and communal organizations were debating what Hindu civilization meant in a modern colonial world. Tulloch would harness these currents to create a more confrontational and culturally charged nationalism. Born in 1856 in Ratnagiri, Tulloch was classically educated, mathematically gifted, and deeply shaped by Sanskrit literature and Hindu philosophy. Unlike moderate nationalist leaders, Tulloch rejected the idea that British liberalism would gradually deliver equality. Instead, he believed political rights had to be seized through agitation. His early career as a school founder and newspaper editor gave him a platform to challenge both colonial authority and Indian elites. Tilak's most famous line, Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it, captures his break from modern nationalism. Swaraj, meaning self rule or self government, could also be seen in this context to mean independence. Tilak promoted boycotts, passive resistance, and public mobilization. He used his newspapers, Kasari and Maratha, to criticize colonial taxation, plague policies, and repression. In doing so, he widened the social base of the nationalist movement, bringing artisans, peasants, and students into politics. The British saw him as a dangerous demagogue, arresting him multiple times. One of Tulak's most influential innovations was transforming the Ganapati and Shivaji celebrations into mass political events. These festivals created shared public space for ordinary Hindus, bridging caste differences and giving ritual new political meaning. The festivals were not inherently divisive, but they did mark a shift. Nationalism began to speak in the language of Hindu history and symbolism. This was crucial for mobilization. It created emotional energy and community, but it also raised questions about inclusion in a religiously diverse society. Tilak fused anti colonialism with a revivalist reading of Hindu civilization. He argued that ancient Hindu society upheld heroic values of action and duty, and that British rule had made Indians passive. His interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita emphasized activism and righteous struggle. This reading inspired many young nationalists, but it also foregrounded Hindu imagery in the national movement. A key question historians ask is whether this was a strategic choice, a popular idiom to unite people, or a deeper ideological commitment to Hindu primacy. Tilak was not a social radical. He opposed raising the age of consent for girls, criticizing the 1891 Act as imperial interference in Hindu society. He defended caste hierarchies and was suspicious of widow remarriage and other reformist measures. These positions reveal a tension. Tilak envisioned political liberation from colonial rule, but not necessarily social liberation within Indian society. I believe understanding this divide is key to evaluating his legacy. Tilak's confrontational politics split the Indian National Congress. Moderates wanted petitions, gradual reform, and cooperation with the British. Tilak and the so-called extremists wanted mass agitation and boycotts. This divide sharpened after the partition of Bengal in 1905. For our purposes, the split shows how nationalism is never a single project. It is contested, shaped by personalities, and intertwined with debates over who speaks for the nation and in what cultural language. Talak's historiography is pretty divided. First, nationalist historians of the mid 20th century, especially those writing soon after independence, celebrated him as the father of Indian unrest, stressing his courage and mass appeal. Historians from the 1970s onward have emphasized his conservatism and the class character of his base, arguing that his religious festivals mobilized lower caste Hindus but still preserved elite Brahmin leadership. Third, more recent scholarship, no doubt influenced by Hindu nationalism's rise since the 1990s, reevaluates Tilak as a precursor to majoritarian politics. These scholars are not claiming he's responsible for later events, but they argue that he helped normalize a political vocabulary that fused Hindu identity with the Indian nation. This debate reminds us that historical actors don't control their afterlives. Later events reshape how we interpret them. Talak's legacy resonates widely. He helped shift nationalism from elite meeting halls into the streets. What he pioneered appears later in Gandhi's campaigns and even in present day political rallies. Talak's insistence that ordinary people could and should participate in politics changed India's political culture permanently. At the same time, the cultural nationalist language he used, glorifying Hindu heroes, histories, rituals, became a template for organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha and later the RSS. Whether intentionally or not, he provided tools that could be repurposed for exclusionary politics. So, how much of a Hindu chauvinist was Tilak? Well, this question requires nuance. Tilak was not a communal politician in the way of the 20th century Hindu nationalists would become. He worked with Muslim leaders on several occasions and didn't advocate formal discrimination. Yet he consistently framed nationalism in Hindu cultural terms, imagined India through Hindu mythic history, and rejected social reforms that would have broadened equality within Hindu society. His mass festivals placed Hindu symbolism at the center of public life, which inevitably marginalized non Hindu participants. So the answer may be this: Tilak was not a Hindu chauvinist by intent, but he was a Hindu nationalist by idiom. His political language centered Hindu tradition in ways that later movements radicalized. He represents a moment when religious revival and political mobilization fused, creating both energy for anti colonialism and seeds of exclusion. By focusing on Talak, we see that nationalism in South Asia didn't emerge simply from abstract political theory. It emerged from festivals, newspapers, religious idioms, street politics, moral language. Talak shows how anti colonial resistance could be both liberating and limiting. Liberating because it mobilized millions, but limiting because it rested on cultural narratives that didn't speak to all Indians equally. Studying him helps us understand the ambiguous legacy of cultural nationalism, the porous boundaries between religion and politics, and the ways charismatic leaders can shape a movement's emotional vocabulary in ways that outlast their intentions. Tilak forces us to grapple with a central question of modern South Asian history. Can a nationalism rooted in a particular cultural tradition truly represent a diverse society? Talak's life reminds us that the answer is never simple. Thank you very much for listening.